Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Steve Osborne on the scientific evidence for God's existence and historical evidence for the resurrection.
I've been a believer now, I should say a Bible-believing believer for almost 50 years. And the more that I have studied the scriptures, the more I study science, the more evidence I find for the existence of God.
Steve Osborne next. Stay with us now for a fascinating and challenging discussion with former atheist and scientist Dr. Steve Osborne about his book, Beyond Chance, From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. Here's Spencer Dahlke.
I was curious if you could tell us what specific evidence it was for you that first challenged your assumptions and led you to examine the case for design.
I spent nearly the first 30 years of my life as what I would describe as a godless pagan. I wasn't interested in God. I wasn't hostile to God, but I wasn't interested. Didn't think I needed him. I'd lived through a pretty difficult adolescence and young adult period without God, and I figured if I made it that far without him, I didn't need him after that. So I was a third-year graduate student in a doctoral program. Things were really going pretty well, other than the fact that we were desperately poor. My wife sort of left her isolated at home with the kids, and she returned to the church of her youth and ended up being saved. And that was sort of a turning point. I saw this incredible, miraculous change in the behavior of my wife. Now, that didn't make me want to be a Christian, but it got my attention. By her influence, kept getting drawn more and more and more into Christianity. I was going to church with her, ended up in Bible studies, ended up in a men's prayer breakfast. I sort of went from being happy with my life to being sort of mostly miserable. And the misery was this spiritual battle within me. One saying, hey, this Christianity stuff looks pretty good. And the other side saying, no, that's just really, really stupid. It's hard to explain to people what a true spiritual battle is like. I mean, it was ripping me apart, really was. My wife's Bible study was in our apartment for a while, and I sat through that. And as I say, I was only obnoxious a few times. But at the end of that, a fellow asked me to have breakfast with him. And at breakfast, he gave me a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell and said, hey, would you read this and give me your opinion as a scientist? And of course, when I read that book, it stunned me because I realized I was like the world's biggest hypocrite. I defined myself as a scientist. I taught classes where I told my students to know what they believe and know for sure and know what evidence it's based on. And I realized that I had dismissed Christianity without bothering to look at the evidence. And once I looked at the evidence for Christ and saw the lives of people that truly believed in Christ, I realized they had something that I didn't, and I kind of wanted that. So I eventually lost the battle and accepted Christ into my life. And being the arrogant guy that I am, I even gave God a 40-day trial period. I'll give you 40 days, and if this stuff really works, then I'll be a Christian. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to my old life. As it turns out, I never look back. I've been a believer now, I should say a Bible-believing believer for almost 50 years. And the more that I have studied the scriptures, the more I study science, the more evidence I find for the existence of God. That's my testimony. And I will say, to me, there is no greater miracle on earth than a changed life. And I was like the world's most reluctant convert. And in fact, I remember a conversation with my wife and her mom at the time. And she said to her mom, he will never become a Christian. This wasn't like somebody that was looking for God and found him. I was so disinterested in God, it's hard to explain. I think a lot of times people think, well, if they accept Christ, then life automatically gets easy. I hate to tell you the truth, that's not true, at least the circumstances. So like most people, we've lived through good times and bad times. I've been unemployed. I've been fired. We've had life-threatening surgeries. We've lost loved ones and family members. So grief, all of the things that comes with life. When we went through the difficult times, God always gave us the strength and the hope to get through those. And then, of course, the good times, it gives you the joy to celebrate.
You mentioned that, Christianity, we think of faith and reason as being rather incompatible. Do you think that's still true? It seems to me maybe we live in a culture where people are starting to turn to faith again, but not towards a Christian faith.
Not that I'm an expert, by the way, but
Sure.
I do have 8 grandchildren in their late teens and early 20s. We just had my first great-grandchild. But when I look at their generation, as a generation, I think they're very lost. And I think they're looking for meaning in life, and they're trying to find it, to me, in a lot of the wrong places. I think there is a resurgence of interest in God, not necessarily the science part, but I think young people are recognizing something is missing. I think they're beginning to look maybe at religion for a way to fill that missing part of their life and to give them purpose. For people that feel like they need more than belief, or they need solid evidence to be able to believe in this unseen God, what I want to tell them is there's a ton of evidence out there. I mean, a ton, and that's what the book is about. Even though the book has a lot of science in it, and in fact, it's the first 11 chapters are principally science-based, it's not a textbook. I spent a lot of time rewriting and editing to get this down to where just the average person can read it. It's been edited to a 9th grade reading level. So even though there's a lot of science in the book, I don't want people to think this is a science book. Anybody can read the book. And once again, don't take my word for it. Go to my website, steveosbornebooks.com, download the first chapter and read it. And you can see for yourself. And I think you'll find it very readable for the non-science person, which is what I wrote it for, which incidentally took me about 22 versions to get it to that point.
Well, you structure your book around, I'm given to understand, around 5 great origins: cosmos, life, complexity, humanity, and Christianity. What inspired you to frame your argument that way, from the origins of the universe to the empty tomb?
The reason you start with the origin of the universe, it is so magnificent. It is so awesome. And it's really sad that we don't ever talk about it. I mean, when's the last time you had a meaningful conversation about the beginning of the universe? Probably never. I mean, we say, science has got that. Well, science doesn't have that. The universe had this spectacular beginning. And once again, the cool thing, they can read the first chapter free and they can see for themselves. There's not a word to describe how incredible the beginning of the universe was. Like I say, the 2 big things, the beginning of the universe and the beginning of life, are clearly spectacular events. And the greatest thing is those are the 2 events that most demonstrate the active involvement, I'll say, an intelligent force. Now, the intelligent force to me is God. You don't have to believe it's God, but you're going to have a hard time believing that intelligence was not involved. I originally did not want to deal with evolution. It's too complicated. It's too controversial. And the more that I ignored that, the more the Lord seemed to kind of keep pushing me in that direction. So I spent 6 months reading about evolution, both sides. What readers will find is that I provide an evidence-based challenge to what I call natural evolution. That is, that evolution is guided by random genetic mutations and natural selection. And there's no need for miracles, supernatural events, or God. And the book provides a evidence-based challenge to that. And I propose what I call biblical evolution, so that we see God being involved from the moment the universe was created until the creation of Adam and Eve and everything in between. The origin of life on Earth still remains science's greatest unsolved mystery. You won't hear that at public school or college. You won't read it anywhere, but it's the truth. And if you really press atheist scientists, they will eventually admit that they really have no clue of how life arose on Earth.
What is it about life that scientists can't explain? Like, I've heard scientists say, we don't understand what human consciousness is. Is that what it is? Because we have biological functions. What is it that science can't explain?
Science can't really explain the evolution that they claim as a fact. They cannot explain the evolution of humans. And I'll just tell you, the big problem they have is there's not enough time. If you look at the timeline and the fossil records for human evolution, there simply is not enough time for random mutations and natural selection to account for that. But you raise a great issue. If we take a look at what I would call the image of God, free will, morality, consciousness, sophisticated language, etc. I dedicated an entire chapter of the book to take a look at the two stories to, if you will, explain human uniqueness. The one story is the naturalist story that nature can explain all of this stuff. And of course, the other is a biblical story. And what you will find is that natural evolution cannot explain the true uniqueness of humans. They claim that they can. I'll give you an example. One of the most fundamental things that we have as creatures of God is free will. You can't get to free will through random genetic mutations and natural selection. It's a deterministic problem. You can never get to free will from evolution. And then, in fact, the truth is, naturalists will tell you that free will is just something that the brain invents to make sense of life. So when you look at free will and morality, does evolution give you sort of a explanation? Yeah, but it doesn't really explain it. And by the way, science has no clue about consciousness. You know, we can put electrodes on people and measure brain waves and do all that stuff. That's not consciousness. And you can't explain the moral compass that is inherent with every human. Yes, maybe some morality developed, because we needed to cooperate with one another, and that probably helped us survive and reproduce. But human morality goes way, way, way beyond that. And in fact, those two issues, free will and morality, would have worked against evolution. Those two traits would have probably reduced people's ability to survive and reproduce. One of the key things about morality is not doing what is right, but doing what we ought to do, which is different. Science can't explain that. God created us for relationship. And once again, naturalists will say, oh, well, if you look at the animal kingdom, they take care of each other, et cetera, et cetera. No, that's not human relationship. We long for relationship. We long to be loved. We long to love. And that doesn't exist anywhere else except in humans. And you can't explain it through natural evolution. So I have a whole chapter, 2 versions of what I call the image of God. And once again, you can use your brain and your logic to see which one you think makes the most sense. I think you and I know the answer to that issue. It's sort of the bridge chapter between the science and the last 2 chapters, which deal with the empty tomb.
Well, my guest today is Steve Osborne. He is a former scientist and professor and author of Beyond Chance, From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. You're a scientist, and you mentioned your specialty is experimental psychology. 3 of these elements, life, complexity, humanity, seem to have a lot to do with kind of like some of those things you were mentioning, like consciousness, free will. How has your expertise with experimental psychology helped inform your argument for a creator God from the evidence we find in the existence of life and humanity and complexity?
I think it's my training as a scientist. Science is a quest for truth, whether it's how planets orbit the sun or whether it's trying to identify why humans have conscious behavior. It's all the same, and it's how you approach things. So when we go to look for truth, let's say in the origin of the universe, we look at the evidence. And in fact, one of the recurring themes of the book is follow the evidence. As a quick aside, in 1660, the Royal Society of London, I think for the investigation of natural history, their motto was, and I'll probably mispronounce this, but it's nullius in verba, which is take nobody's word for it. This was the birth of modern science. And what's their motto? Don't take anybody's word for it. Prior to that, the science had sort of embraced the Greek philosophy of Aristotle, where you could use reason and logic to arrive at truth. And modern science says, no, that doesn't work. We're going to replace pure reason and logic with observation and experimentation. You start with a skeptic and you look at the evidence and you beat the evidence and you twist it and you turn it and you try to find out what makes the most sense. What is the best explanation based on the available evidence? And that's science. Whether we're talking about first life or how did new body plans evolve without any obvious ancestors, to why are we these incredible moral creatures? Even though we violate that morality, it's still there. And the interesting thing is it's universal over the ages and it's universal across cultures. Different cultures implement that differently, but at the core, we pretty much all have the same morality. For example, by the way, there's never been a culture where cowards were esteemed or stealing from your family or your loved ones. But it's not so much about experimental, it's about science and the quest for truth. Whether you're a physicist or a chemist or an evolutionary biologist, where all of those are looking for truth. Atheists and naturalists are so biased that I believe it is difficult for them to see the truth even when it's presented to them. If you look biblically, you'll know that God blinds the eyes of sinners in some cases, and I think modern science is that in spades. I find it amazing that there is so much scientific evidence for God, and there's so little recognition in the overall community because the naturalists control the narrative. They have made it illegal to teach creation or intelligent design in grade school. In college, it's reinforced. If you're a professor and you try to teach it, you're jeopardizing your position. It's really that difficult. Everywhere we look, you see the naturalist position, the media, museums, science displays. And I will tell you my opinion and the opinion of a lot of really, really smart scientists whose lunch I couldn't even carry. They believe that natural evolution is a failed theory. The truth is that the general public does not hear the truth. And, one of the purposes of my book, Beyond Chance, is to try to show them the evidence and the truth about creation. Creation doesn't talk. It shouts, it screams, it sings about God as the creator.
We think of faith as like this blind, anti-rational sort of a thing where it's just like we're going to latch onto something we can't. But faith just means trust. And so the question is, what do we put our trust in? An intelligent creator or whatever.
So by the way, I have to read this. We have to say nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it. No, I think people generally, especially skeptics, think that Christianity is just having a bunch of faith, even if your faith is inconsistent with what we think we know about science. And that's not true. By the way, one of the battles that I had with accepting Christianity is it had to make sense. It had to be intellectually defensible. I would have never become a Christian. It would have never happened. And I want to say to people, you don't have to commit intellectual suicide to become a Christian. You don't have to give up 10 IQ points. I believe that Christians who know the science are the smartest guy or woman in the room. Faith is fantastic, but for me, faith has to be built on evidence. And the good news is the evidence is abundant. It's not a little here and a little there. I think it's overwhelming. When you take all the scientific evidence, which is about the first 11 chapters of my book, and then the last 2 chapters, we switch from scientific evidence to historical evidence, which is the empty tomb. And incidentally, the resurrection of Christ is about as close as you can come to a historical fact without saying it's a fact. When you take the scientific evidence and the historical evidence and put the two together, it is so overwhelming, so compelling that it at least needs to be acknowledged by skeptics, atheists, and of course, believers alike.
I would not be doing my due diligence if I did not, of course, ask about the empty tomb. It's interesting that you throw this in as the fact that Christ lived among us. Tell us about how you approached.
When you first look at the book, which is a lot of science, and then you go, well, how did you get from science to the empty tomb? Isn't that kind of a big leap? So here's the issue. The first 11 chapters basically creates the case for God as creator. Lots of evidence. That leads us to the question, was God a distant architect, or was he a personal creator? In other words, did God create the heavens and the earth and then sit back to watch the show? Which, by the way, is possible. The empty tomb answers that question. And what we see is in fact, if Christ rose from the dead, that sort of becomes, if you will, the capstone for all the scientific evidence. In fact, it's sort of like the grand finale. Here's all the historical stuff. And oh, by the way, Christ came to earth, lived among us for a while, died, and rose from the dead. So how do you like that? I mean, how's that for evidence? And by the way, the evidence for the resurrection, I believe, is overwhelming. One chapter basically lays out the evidence, and the second chapter offers all the naturalistic explanations for those events. For example, I'm sure you've heard, Christ didn't really die on the cross. He just became unconscious and then was later revived in the tomb, what's called the swoon theory. So I go through all of those alternative explanations. And what you find is when you exhaust all of the alternative explanations, none of them account for all of the evidence. I personally think that once you look at the evidence, it requires far more faith to remain an atheist than it does to be a Christian. In fact, I think atheists have enormous faith, and quite frankly, you know what it's based on? It's based on nothing. What do you believe? Well, I believe in nothing. Nothing is hard to believe in the face of all the evidence.
It's Occam's razor. If you have this set of data, perhaps the simplest explanation is that, well, what if Jesus actually just did rise from the dead?
Like I say, we have the scientific evidence, but we have the historical evidence. And by the way, historical evidence is quite compelling, probably more than people think. Unless you've actually, by the way, until I really got into this, I didn't realize. I mean, I believed he rose from the dead, and there was some evidence, and a lot of eyewitnesses, so I'm okay with that. But when you walk your way through the evidence itself, I think it's overwhelming. So I think, once again, when you combine the scientific evidence with the historical evidence, it creates, to me, an absolutely compelling case for the existence of God. I think it's hard to take a look at that evidence and say, yeah, but I'm still, there's nothing to see here. I think that's a really difficult position as a scientist and as an intellectual approach to the issue of God.
Could you give us a crash course on science? How can Christians question their faith well so that it develops their trust in a creator God rather than, deconstructs and turns them away?
It's a good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. I think people need to do some real introspection and ask themselves, what does it take to believe in something? Pick something you believe in and why you believe it. If you have investments and you have an advisor, why do you believe that advisor is going to wisely invest your money so that in a few years you have more money than you started with? Why do you have faith that the government is actually going to protect you? What evidence do you need to believe that? We actually do a lot of, maybe, I won't say unconscious, but sort of unconscious. We make those comparisons all the time. And we based it on evidence. Is the sun going to come up tomorrow? Sure it is, because it always does. Does that mean it's coming up tomorrow? Not necessarily. Life is belief. Life is having faith. You could not live without faith. We have faith that we're going to wake up the next day. By the way, a lot of people aren't going to wake up. They're going to give up their lives today. We believe that the government will protect us from foreign threats. We believe that the police will protect us from local threats. We believe our job will be there tomorrow, which, by the way, I found that a couple of times is not true. Everybody believes a lot. And in fact, we have a tremendous amount of faith. The question that Christians and people in general should ask is, what's the basis of my faith? We have tremendous faith. I mean, as we walk through the day, when we come to an intersection where there's a traffic light, we believe that the other guy is going to stop, which, by the way, is not always a really good belief to have. We have faith that our children will grow up to be Bible-believing Christians, right? We believe that hopefully that we'll have enough money when the day comes that we could retire. So life is an adventure or a journey of faith. Ask yourselves, why do I believe this? What is the evidence for my faith? And I think we do the same thing with Christianity. I want all people to believe, but I think every Christian alive needs to ask the question, why do I believe in God? Why do I believe the Bible is the Word of God? I think people cripple themselves if they try to duck those questions and just say, well, I have faith. The Bible says that I believe it. Muslims are saying the same thing. The Quran says that I believe it. So we need to have that evidence, some people more than others, but I think we always need to question the evidence. God never asked people to be stupid or blind or to do anything without evidence. In fact, the Bible repeatedly tells people, look at the evidence. In the grand finale, God came to earth himself in the form of a human being. Scripture says he lived among us for a while. We were able to behold his glory. We've seen him. At least that was the evidence for the people. And that was, by the way, that was the evidence for the people who wrote the New Testament. The disciples lived with this guy. They traveled with him. They listened to his sermons. They ate with him. They talked with him. They had a tremendous amount of evidence on which they based the New Testament. So it's always about the evidence. I think when it comes down to it, it's the evidence for everybody. And the wonderful news for Christians is that the evidence is there. It's abundant. It's objective. And I always say, don't take my word for it. Don't take anybody's word for it. The most wonderful thing that can happen to Christians is to discover the truth themselves. You can hear the truth from somebody, and we like that, and we listen to pastors and people we admire. But at the end of the day, you have to discover the truth for yourself for it to be lasting and meaningful.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, scientist and former atheist, Dr. Steve Osborne. He's author of Beyond Chance, From the Big Bang to the Empty Tomb. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join us again on Monday at the same time for another edition of His People.